All right. Let me send out Discord. Whoops. Keep misspelling the word designing. Okay. All right. Cool. My hair's doing funky things, I guess. So I will say I don't entirely know what I should have up right now. Let me make a Google Doc. Yo, what's up, Sigerman? He's alive, but I sleep. Okay, have a good night. Thanks for popping in. Hey, Rearhead. I don't have time, but I am destined to spam this. Thank you. I appreciate it. I thought I had a folder for this. I do. Okay. This guy. Okay. Yo, what's up, RGC? Yo, what's up, Chlortax? How's it going? Okay. Can you guys even hear the music? Seems rather low. Hang on. Okay. I don't want it to be too loud. 3-stream watch streak? No way. Don't do that. Dear God, what just happened? Don't. Okay. Google, why have you done this to your document? Okay. I feel like my light is being weird. Okay, so if you've read the stream title, you will know that I am working on a game. Have fun with game dev. Will hopefully hear us on Saturday. Nice. Yeah, I'm expecting at least a handful of people on Saturday, so I'm excited. But yeah, have a good one. I appreciate you popping in. Yeah, hopefully it'll be good. I've heard some good responses so far. I'll be there on Saturday if I can. Nice. Do you think you're gonna be running, or do you just want to watch? Because that was one of the main things that I wanted to get across, is that like you don't have to participate if you don't want to. You could just like be there and chill out. Which, you know, chances are if you're in the speedrunning Discord, you're probably gonna want to speedrun anyway. But you know, I just wanted to do it. What time is it again? You can say any time zone. I can convert it to EST. It is, what did I say? 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock CST. I think I'll play for fun, but I won't finish fast at all. That's fine. Yeah, no, the document that I sent out in the announcement has all the info on it. So, like, a race is going to last a half an hour. Approximately. So, as long as you finish within a half an hour, you're good. Even if you don't finish within a half an hour, it should be fine. We'll see if I can make it. All right. It would be cool. Okay. So what am I doing today? So, some of you may know. I think Chlortax probably knows. But I have been on and off working on a project that I call A Part of You. And it's been a bit of a struggle to put this thing together, because I have tried a couple of different languages, mainly like C++, C Sharp. I've tried Unity, I've tried Godot, Godot, however you want to pronounce it. I'm probably going to call it Godot. And pretty much every time I try and like create something for the project, I get stuck. And it's kind of tricky to explain why, but I'll do my best. So typically what I'll do is I'll write some code that I think will be relevant to the project. And then eventually I'll hit a point where like I won't be able to continue writing code because I have to solve some design problem. Right? Like there's something that my code doesn't account for, or there's some decision that needs to be made that I can't just, spit the code out for. And so, obviously,
add back the sound effect for the TTS so you're not randomly surprised.
I can't add a delay to the TTS. So either the first part of your TTS message is going to get cut off, or we just don't have an alert. I'm fine without having the alert. I am perfectly okay with that. But if you guys think I should have the alert, then I can add it back if you want to, but I think it's okay. So I think part of the reason that happens is because I don't have like a very clear design. It's up to you. If it's up to me, I'm going to leave it off. And I'll just get surprised by TTS. So I just kind of need to sit down and make some decisions about what I want the game to be and what I want it to look like from a technical perspective. Yo, what's up, Glitch? How's it going? GDD time. So yeah, that's the idea. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really know where to start, but I'm going to start nonetheless. Hang on, is this a good... Let me actually set up a new thing here. Okay, well... That's not exactly what I wanted to happen. Hang on. Can I do this? Uh-huh. Is that, Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm messing with stuff. Why? What? What? Bro, really? Okay. Hang on. Give me a second. Cause I want... Okay, get rid of that. Yes. Go back to here. Sorry, I'm moving around a bunch. I didn't realize I didn't have this set up yet. Yes. Yes. This. Okay. Let me crop myself a little bit better here. Sorry, editing stream layout live. This should be fine. There we go. Now I don't take up as much of the screen here. Why? What? It will not let me move my camera? Hello? What? What is it doing, dude? What the? Okay, whatever. I guess I'm not going to be in the top corner because OBS legitimately will not let me move my camera. It's like, dude, what? Best money I've ever spent. All right, well, okay. My online friend group has gotten into Balatro now, including me. It started with one of us hearing from his IRL friends and getting obsessed, and now most of us are playing it. It's low-key a peak game. It is. I'm surprised you didn't get into it during its peak, because it was very popular for a while. Is there a way to lock objects in OBS? Maybe you accidentally locked it. Oh, that's a good point. There we go. RGC, you are a genius. Okay, chat. You can come up here next to me. Doesn't that feel better? We're so much closer now. Okay, cool. Okay. To the document. So yeah, I don't know where to begin with this. So I guess what I want is a 2D top-down dungeon crawler, right? That's sort of the base thing that we're working with. 2D top-down. Does that have a hyphen? Who cares? Dungeon crawler. And Google Docs, my favorite game to watch on Twitch. I am in the correct category. I did not say that I was making a game. Yeah, just do that. I don't care about you guys seeing my bookmarks. It just takes up space. So one of my biggest inspirations here for this game is going to be Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. So this is the kind of vibe of the gameplay, at least. Not necessarily like, you know, you're playing as a little monster, but you know, this kind of dungeon-y stuff, and these are like the more modern versions, which display the dungeon in a not so obvious way, I feel like. Red Rescue Team, not Reddit. Don't take me to Reddit, please. No, wait, no images. Hello? Okay, so there are absolutely no images associated with... There we go. You're a little monster. Give me... Okay, here we go. So something like this. This looks... Why is it so tiny? Where's open a new tab? Okay. So this is kind of what I'm wanting. So it's 2D top down, right? And it's all based on a grid. DuckDuckGo, my beloved. Truly. So basically, you move up, down, left, right. In the actual game, you can also technically move diagonally, but, you know, just for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume you can only move up, down, left, right. And everything is turn-based. So the enemies don't move unless you do something, whether it be like use like attack, you move, you use an item, you know, the enemies only do something when you also do something. So it's all turn-based. And that part I want to keep. This little overlay is like a mini map, and then some other UI stuff that's probably going to be different, but excuse me. Why are the 16-bit graphics small? No, that's the image resolution is small. You can have a high resolution image of 16-bit graphics. So that's sort of the mechanics that I want to bring over. So it's 2D top-down, turn-based, and you know, control your little character. So it's very similar to a roguelike. Although I think there are like technical definitions for what does and does not count as a roguelike, but it's like a roguelike, right? In that sense, at least. You don't need high res, so why have? Because then I have to zoom in, and then it looks blurry because the zooming in doesn't work properly. It doesn't have the right scaling mode by default, so now it's all fuzzy. Wrong? What do you mean wrong? Look, do you not see how fuzzy this is? Yeah, so that's one of the biggest inspirations. Top-down, turn-based. This is going to be a based game, all right? By definition. Dungeon crawler. So I've got all of the story figured out. All of the lore, you know. Somebody's doing something outside my window. I've been working on this thing for a while, so I've got the story figured out. Nearest neighbor upscaling is just better. Hatred to smooth scaling. I'm okay with smooth scaling sometimes. If it gets it right, then it gets it right, you know? But especially in this scenario, it's just... Yeah, so I've got the story figured out. So you're going to be playing as, believe it or not, a rogue character. Right? Imagine like the classic D&D rogue archetype. And if you don't know what D&D is, then you're kind of a nerd. So, so yeah, you're going to be a controlling character. The idea is, so it very much is like a roguelike. So the idea is that your character wakes up in the middle of a dungeon with all of their memories gone. So they have no idea why they're there. And like slowly throughout the game, you unlock like cutscenes or memories that eventually you can put them together and figure out why you're in the dungeon, right? Spoilers, I'm not gonna give away what those memories are, like why the character's in the dungeon, so don't worry about me spoiling anything. I'm gonna keep all of that a secret, all right? But you're in the dungeon, you don't remember why you're there. And what I'm imagining, like the main hook to be, is that all of the enemy behaviors and all of the effect on the items are somewhat random. So like typically when you have a roguelike, there's like a giant pool of potential items. Like let's take Balatro for example. There are a bunch of possible jokers that you could get. And the game just randomly picks from that pool. Obviously they're weighted differently based on how rare they are, but there's a giant pool of pre-existing jokers and the game just picks from one of them. The idea for this is that I want the effects of the items to be randomly generated. So we're not just randomly picking from a pre-existing pool, the pool itself is being randomly generated. And that's probably why this has taken me so long to figure out, because that's not an easy thing to do. Gonna be hard to do balancing for that game? Yeah. The other thing is that it's going to be really hard to avoid infinites because it's very possible that you can just get like 2 items that are like every time you move up you gain a health and also you move down, and then there's a second item that says every time you move down you move back up, and then you just like you're like stuck in an infinite loop of just moving up and down. But you know, that's a problem for later. I want it crusty as God intended. Fair enough. That's a fair opinion. If you don't know what D&D is, you're a nerd. Isn't it the opposite? No. At this point, D&D is pretty widely known, you know? If you don't know what it is, you've got to be living under a rock. So the chaos mode of Nubby's Number Factory, but with the concept in mind for game design. I've heard of Nubby's Number Factory, and I've seen very little gameplay of it, but I don't actually like know what it is or how it works. I mean, we have been brainstorming this idea for like 3 or 4 years at this point, I think. Yeah. Yes, pretty much. Grid. It is also grid based. It's extra based. Based times 2. I was gonna play Nubbies last night. Euphoric gameplay. Is it really? How much is it? I might have to get that. I got what's it called? Clover Pit, I think it is, which is like the slot machine roguelike. And that was pretty addicting. It's extra based times 2. It is. It's both grid based and turn based. Okay. So that's the idea, and the way that we could handle, you know, certain things being overpowered is we can put limitations on it. So the way that I've imagined this previously is that you have some kind of trigger, some kind of target generator, and some kind of condition. Whoops. Condition. So these 3 things together would create an effect, right? So the trigger would be like the action that occurs to, you know, potentially have this effect happen. Then you've got the target generator, which figures out what creatures or items or things in the dungeon that are going to be affected. And then the condition would be like, okay, what things have to be true in order for this effect to actually do what it's trying to do. And then I guess I forgot this thing. So the action is like what's actually going to happen. So, for example, if you had an item that was like every time you move upwards, you gain 1 health. So the condition wouldn't matter in that case, but the trigger would be the player moving in the upwards so I guess the trigger would be like the player moving. The condition would be that the movement is in the up direction. Target generator would return the player's health, and then the action would be increasing that health value by 1. Let's just say, for example. So then you can randomly generate effects by just, having these be somewhat random. And, you could get a little meta with it by saying, okay, triggers, well, you can create a pool of predefined triggers and then just have the game randomly pick from that pool. And then you can have a random pool of target generators and a random pool of conditions and a random pool of actions, etc., etc. And then all of those would combine to create effectively a randomly generated effect. And then you could just slap the effect onto an item or something. And then so the way that you could control, not having infinites and not having stuff that's super overpowered is you could change the way that you pick a trigger, a target generator, a condition, and action based on like what the effect already has. So like, let's say your target generator is going to pick every single enemy on the current floor of the dungeon. You're going to have some kind of smart system that can be like, okay, so these are a lot of important targets. Let's maybe not pick an action that's like immediately kill them, right? Because that would be pretty overpowered. So there is going to have to be a somewhat intelligent system that can like pick these components to make sure that everything is balanced, but that seems like a problem for later. Maybe you can make a maximum number of steps per turn. Like each item has a set of steps that it does, and you rearrange them in your hotbar to change the executing order. But there's a max number of steps that can run per turn, which prevents infinite loops. If you don't like that idea, I might try making my own game around it. It sounds sick now that I think about it. Yeah, I'm not too interested in that idea for this game, but I would be curious to see what yours ends up being. So I do have a game. Let me pull up Steam here, because I don't know that I have it. I don't know that I have it downloaded. But what you just described very much reminds me of it. Store page. So it's this guy. It's called Auto Rogue. And the idea is that you've got these like things where every turn, it uses a certain amount of energy or magic or whatever to like do these actions, and you can rearrange them to have them execute in different orders, and you can like nest them so that ones happen after certain ones. It's pretty cool, and it sounds very similar to what you were describing. So I would recommend checking out this game. I had a lot of fun with it. Let me get my chat back. Okay. So that's the way that I'm imagining we could tackle that issue. Now, there are some slightly more technical things that we have to figure out in order to get this to work properly, but for now, that's the idea. So, what are the other major decisions that I wanted to figure out is, well, I guess just that in general. So like what I'd like to be able to do is create a system that allows for something like this, where like you can randomly generate effects. But then I think to make it easier to, I guess, just produce something, I would want to manually create some effects. But like all the logic underneath would still be able to handle, you know, basically building an effect by just you providing it with these 4 things. But then I would just like manually create each of these things instead of randomly generating them. Idea: you lose a random effect on a slower cycle than gaining, so that you can't safely rely on an OP effect. Interesting. So the other thing that I was considering is, because it's turn-based, what I can do is I can say that I don't know that I really like this idea, but what I can do is I can say that every effect can only proc a single time per turn. So if I move my character up and I have some effect that's like every time you move up, gain 1 health, that would trigger and I would gain 1 health. And then let's say that I have a different item that says every time you move up again, right? Then that would trigger and I would move up a second time. So this first thing would not trigger then, because it's already procced that turn. And then the turn wouldn't reset until you gain control of your character again. So that's like one idea, but I'm not a huge fan of that, because if you have an item that says gain health every time you move up, then you would expect to gain health twice. But yeah. So like I said, I want to create a system that allows for randomly generated effects, but I think for the sake of simplicity, I won't actually randomly generate them to begin with, and we can, you know, solve the whole randomly generated effects problem later. What was the other thing? There were like 3 things, and I wanted to save one of them for last, but I don't remember the second major thing. So one of the other ideas that I had was that, so in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, you play the game 1 floor at a time. So when you enter the dungeon, you're on a single 2-dimensional grid, and you find where the stairs are. And when you step on the stair tile, you go down a floor, and you're placed somewhat randomly inside of the newly generated floor, and then you gotta find the stair tile again. What I'm considering is having 3 floors accessible at one time, and having ladders in between all of them, so that your character can move between all 3 floors at any given time. And that way, you know, if you want to leave an item in a chest on the top floor and then keep exploring, you know, you could do something like that if you wanted to. Which I think isn't like much different than having, you know, just a dungeon floor that's 3 times as big. But I don't know. Maybe it would make it easier to traverse than having a single 2D floor that's just 3 times as big. Not sure. Okay. So what do I want the interface for this to look like? I think is a good question. So I want to be able to randomly generate the dungeon floors, right? And I obviously don't want all of the floors of a dungeon to be generated at once, because I only really want to generate the floors, or I guess load is probably a better term to use. I don't really want to load all of the floors of the dungeon all at once, right? Because I can have transitions in between. Like, let's just take that idea from before and say that we're running with it, right? So the player has access to 3 different floors, and there's all 3 floors are all loaded at a given time. And then when you want to move on to the next area, you go through like these giant doors, and they take you to the next floor, or to the next set of 3 floors, I should say. Yeah. I just completely lost my train of thought. Right. Okay, so I only want basically 3 floors of the dungeon to be loaded at any given time. So from like a technical perspective, that would effectively just be 3 two-dimensional grids, right? 3 2D arrays, if you will. Because the other thing about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon that I do want to bring over is the idea that there can be multiple things in any cell of the grid. So like, you can have a grid cell that contains a ground tile, which are like, you know, these tiles that you can walk on. They can obviously contain a character. They could also contain an item. So in this game, you can like drop an item on the ground, and you can also step onto that item without picking it up. And so if you do that, then there's a ground tile, there's an item, and there's a character all in the same cell of the grid. Excuse me. And then, you know, you can have like a wall instead of a ground, which, if I remember correctly, certain ghost types can actually move through walls. So you could potentially have a wall and a ghost type character in the same cell of the grid. So when I say a 2D grid, it would kind of be like a 2D grid where the cells themselves have layers, right? There could be like a ground layer, an item layer, a creature layer, for example. And so these things can all like stack on top of each other in the same grid cell. So then on the technical side, you could say kind of what I said before, where you can have a 2D grid of cells where the cell object can have multiple things in it. Or you could have multiple 2-dimensional arrays, each one representing a layer. And I think that second option is technically better. So let me say multiple 2D arrays. Per floor represents layers. Right. So then one of the issues that I ran into when actually like implementing this thing is from like an object-oriented perspective, you can have like a base class called like entity, right? And then you can have, you know, like a creature, and then you can either have like an enemy. Yeah, let's just say enemy for now. You could have like an enemy or the player or an NPC or something like that, but let's just say enemy, right? But you could also have, from the entity, you could also have an item, right? And then, you know, let's just say apple or something. So that if I want to copy what Pokemon Mystery Dungeon has, which is basically one layer per type of thing, then would I say have like a single 2D array for creatures and then another single 2D array for items? Or do I just have like two 2D arrays for entities? And then, you know, because object-oriented is the way that it is, you would just be able to throw any entity you want in here, whether it be a creature or an item, because they both inherit from entity. So that's one of the decisions that I need to make. And I don't know what's better. I think they both have pros and cons, and I'm kind of torn. I don't know whether it's better to like limit certain layers of a floor to be certain types of entities, or if I should just allow any type of entity and then sort of just keep in mind that I should separate each layer by their type, by their entity type. Because that's definitely a way to go, where it's just like, okay, you can put whatever entity you want, but by convention, you know, we're going to put creatures on layer 1 and items on layer 2, for example. And, like, I would really like the ability to restrict what entity type. And actually, it would be somewhat... would be somewhat easier to do that with if we have multiple 2D arrays per floor. I don't think that would have like a negative impact on memory usage. I think that would be fine. So I'm less inclined to do something like this. So I kind of want one layer. You have to have creatures on it. You are not allowed to add any other entity type other than creature to it. And then another layer for, let's say, items. You are not allowed to add creatures to the items layer. To me, that makes sense. But this is one of the issues that I've been running into when just like throwing myself into coding, is that actually creating these restrictions has been somewhat difficult for me to figure out. And maybe that's just a skill issue. But I think at this point we're just designing stuff, right? So I think it's okay to have this kind of a goal in mind, and then we can figure out how to implement it later. Okay. So that third thing that I was talking about earlier, about like one of my lofty goals, is that I think it would be really, really cool. Well, okay, a couple of things. I think it would be really cool to have a dungeon editor, right, where somebody could manually go in and create their own dungeon and like basically put together their own effects and, attach it to items, and they can choose where in the dungeon the item goes, and then, you could share your dungeons to anybody who wants to play, right? I think that would be cool, but that's obviously a thing that comes way later. The other idea that I had was a sort of relay race. So part of what is going to make this game different than Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is that when you die in a part of you, the whole gimmick is that, like, every time you die, your character loses their memories again, right? That's why when you first start the game, your character doesn't have any memories. They don't remember where they are. Every time you die in the dungeon, you lose your memories. So I think it would be a cool idea to make a sort of co-op multiplayer thing. Not really, but sort of. So when you die, instead of like restarting the run, your save would effectively be uploaded to, somewhere, some server, some database, whatever. And then if somebody else wanted to play this like co-op game mode, they would hit the play button, and then it would randomly decide whether or not to start a brand new run or whether or not to pull a random run from that database and basically start them where you left off. And then it just it's like a relay race where every time somebody dies, it gets put back up into the database, and then somebody else can continue the run. And it just keeps going until somebody eventually wins, right? I think that would be a cool game mode. But that's obviously, again, something that's very far off, quite complicated, so probably not going to worry about that. But, that's an idea. Okay, back to something a little bit more reasonable. So I do want to restrict each layer to a certain type of entity. And then I want to have an entire component system, I think. Because one of the other things that I mentioned is that I want enemy behavior to be randomly generated. Excuse me. So I want some kind of component system, and a single entity is going to have a list of components, right? And these components are going to determine what the entity can do. So it's going to be very similar to the way that a game engine works, think Unity, right? Where you can create a mono behavior and you can just attach a bunch of mono behaviors to your game objects. Very similar thing. So the component is going to be receiving event notifications, effectively. So whenever something happens in the dungeon, some data about what just happened is going to be sent to every single component that's in the dungeon. And then the component can determine, what to do. And maybe I'm getting entity and or maybe I'm getting effect and components mixed up. Because like what I'm imagining is there being some kind of like movement component, right? Which allows the entity to change its location from tile to tile or from cell to cell, whatever. And so that's not really an effect, that's just... Although maybe technically it does count as an effect. It's like, okay, when the player presses a button. Does that really count as an effect? I mean, you can, like, make it an effect, I guess. Interesting. Yeah, I think you could do that. Hmm. But what if you need extra state? Yeah, okay, so you still would need components. So components would have some kind of extra state. So let's say health, for example. You could have a health component. And you could attach that to a creature, right? So then would components have effects? Because then we would only really need... Yeah, so we would only really need to send those event notifications to the effects themselves. I don't know that it really makes sense for a component to have an effect. Does it? I feel like that gets nested a little bit too far. So what I'm trying to figure out is whether or not an entity should have an effect or a component should have an effect. Because an entity definitely is going to have multiple components attached to it. But what, like, for example, what I could do is I could make, like an increment health component that doesn't actually have any state, but what it does have is an effect that increments your health. But is that getting too much? Should I just have the entity directly have the effect instead of an entity having a component that has an effect? Not sure. Maybe I don't call it effect. Maybe I just call it something else and it would make more sense. reaction, maybe? That's not how you spell that. So then I feel like, whoops, I feel like it would make sense for an entity to have that, to have a reaction then. Right, because the only thing, the only reason this like would actually do anything is in response to something happening. So I feel like it makes sense to call it a reaction rather than just an effect. I feel like that makes sense. So then an entity would have, like, let's say a list of reactions and a list of components. And then the difference between these two would be that a reaction is like something that happens, whereas a component is just the state. Like it would, you know, contain the amount of health that you have, or the amount of energy that you have, or your inventory, for example. Okay, yeah. I feel like that's starting to click a little bit better. Because I think before what I was trying to do is just have an entity only have reactions. And then I tried it again, and I wanted entities to only have components. But I think it makes much more sense to separate them based on, okay, a component has a state, and a reaction is like something that happens. And an entity can like pick and choose which ones it has. For some reason it didn't work. I'm still trying to find out why. That is accurate. I am trying to find out why my previous attempts have not worked. I feel like this makes sense, though. So then before when I tried to implement something like this, I called it an effect, but I'll refer to it now as a reaction. Before, when I tried to make a reaction-based system, the issue that I ran into was that, like, I wanted a target generator to be defined by the type of objects that it returned. Right? So you could imagine a reaction that's like, let's say like an AoE attack, right? So deals damage to all enemies within 2 tiles of yourself. So you would have to have some kind of method, some kind of function that goes out and finds, like, it populates a list of all the enemies that are within 2 tiles, right? So that would be the job of the target generator. So the problem that I was running into is that, like, okay, in that scenario where I want a list of all the enemies, the type that this function is going to return is it's going to be some kind of array of, you know, enemies, for example. And the problem with that is that it's really difficult to make this sort of generic reaction object. Because then you can't just say, well, a reaction has a target generator. There's now this return type that's attached to it. And, like, that becomes a whole different thing. Because it's not just a target generator, it's specifically a target generator that returns a list of enemies. So then, like, I don't know, is the object-oriented way of doing that just making a target generator, and then, like, having another class that's just target generator with the, you know, return type, and that would like inherit from this generic target generator, or like the base target generator. I part of the reason I don't like that is because if I wanted some way... Yo, thank you for the hydrate. I don't know why I would want this, but let's say I want some way of getting a list of all of the target generators for all the reactions that a certain entity has. So I would have to cast all of the target generators as this base target generator. But then if I wanted to like do something with the target generator, I don't know what its return type is, because that's tied to the definition of the child class. So that I could do the really stupid thing of just saying, okay, all target generators are going to return just a list of generic objects. And then a target generator class is going to have some state that like stores the return type. Maybe target generator that generates the type of target as a string, then a target numerator that returns a value for each usage of the target as a number. Generates the type of target as a string. And the numerator that returns a value for each usage of the target as a number. I may be misinterpreting what the idea is. I'm trying to work it out. I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of returning the type as a string. So just to clarify, so the role of the target generator is... Let me go through the example that I went through before, and then I'll give another example. So if I have some, let's say a sword, like a magic sword, that deals damage to all enemies within 2 tiles of myself, the job of the target generator is to fetch a list of all the enemies within 2 tiles. In that scenario. Now, there could potentially also be a scenario in which I have an item that's like a potion, where I can go into my inventory and select it and use it, and then the target generator would be my health value, the player's health value, rather than a list of enemies. That would be the role of the target generator. So it's supposed to return the things that are going to be affected. And so because they're going to have like all kinds of different return types, I don't really feel like it's super easy to make some generic reaction object, because these are all going to be... Because all the target generators are going to have to be very specific to whatever type it is that they're returning. So that's what I was kind of saying about, like, maybe I just have a base class here, and then I can extend that base class and define the return type in the child class here. And that way I can just do this and not necessarily define the return type within my reaction object. But that just feels weird. Because then it's like, okay, the only purpose of the target generator is to be the base class for all the other target generators, which, like, I don't know how to feel about that. This is one of the main issues that I've been running into trying to implement this thing, is that, like, I try to impose type restrictions on some stuff, but it only makes it more difficult for me to actually, like, put together these things. So I need some kind of abstract thing called a reaction. And within a reaction, I need some abstract thing called a target generator. Now, when you're not dealing with the abstract, the target generator is going to have to return something. It's going to have to return something. So whatever that function is going to have a return type. Because, like, the issue is that return type has to be generic. Because you don't necessarily know what type is going to be returned. So that was kind of my idea earlier about, you know, a target generator having some kind of state that just stores the return type. And then what I can do is I can just say, okay, all target generators are going to return an object. Right, because, like, in C#, object is, like, the base class for, like, everything. So you can just say, okay, it's going to return an object, and whatever is using the target generator, it is their job to take this object and transform it into whatever type is necessary. So then the target generator can, like, do what it needs to do. It transforms its return type into an object, and then whatever else needs to use it can transform it back into whatever it needs. That way we don't necessarily need this generic thing. It's just, okay, all target generators return an object. The problem with that is that specifically in C#, that's a very slow operation, relatively speaking. I think it's called boxing. C# boxing. Boxing is the process of converting a value type to the type object or to any interface type implemented by this value type. Oh, is it only... Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so it's only computationally expensive if you're trying to convert a value type to an object. Which in our situation is never going to happen. Because the target generator has to return a reference to something, which is never a value type. It's always going to be a reference type. So in C#, there's like these two major type categories. There's a value type and a return type. Or not a return type. A value type and a reference type. All objects, everything that inherits from the generic object is a reference type. And anything like an integer or a double or like, you know, those kind of things, those are all value types. Where when you access them, I think the easiest way to know the difference is that when you pass the thing into a function as a parameter, is it going to make a copy of the value, or is it going to give you a reference to the value? So like if you make a custom class in C#, and then you instantiate that class to make an object, and then you pass that object into a function, it does not make a copy of that object. It just provides a reference to that object. So I've got Stonebot code up. Maybe I can find an example of this somewhere. Is there a more obvious place where I'm doing this? Okay, I guess okay, here would be a... Can I not zoom in? I can't zoom in using Control Plus. Okay, so like here would be a good example of the difference between a value type and a reference type. So this on WebSocket client full closure. So I'm passing in a nullable object. This question mark just means that this could be null. So I'm passing in as a parameter an object and some event arguments. So this, you can see it's a class. See that class system on the pop-up? So that means that this is a reference type, which means that when I call this function and I give it this parameter, it's not going to copy the data that's in here. It's just going to give a reference to this original object. So where am I actually like calling this? Oh, okay. That's a little bit unhelpful, actually. But basically, if I wanted to, I could, you know, say, like, args dot... okay, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here, I think. But this connect state is an enum, which I believe is always a reference type, or not a reference type, a value type. So whenever I call this function, for example, it's always going to make a copy of this. Connect state.disconnected. It's going to make a copy of that and then throw that into the function. Whereas with reference types, it's just going to give you a reference to the object instead of copying it. You could go down a whole rabbit hole with that, but basically the idea is that I read this line that said, in relation to simple assignments, boxing and unboxing are computationally expensive processes. But it seems like that only applies when you're trying to convert a value type, something that is a value type, to an object. Which in our use case, because this is a target generator, and we're going to need to actually like do stuff with the targets that are generated, we're not, those objects are not going to be passed, they're not going to be copy pasted. We need a reference to the original object so that we can actually do something with it. So the target generator is never going to generate a value type, which is the whole reason I was avoiding it in the first place. So this does just work. And I was paranoid for absolutely no reason. I can just have a basic target generator and then have a child class that specifies the return type, and then I can just freely cast it to an object and back. And it's not going to be that expensive. At least not as expensive as I was expecting it to be. Okay. I mean, that's good news, but I definitely spent a lot of brain power previously trying to find solutions to this problem, so, you know, mildly irritating, but okay. That's a solution. Okay. You could just imagine these are, you know, classes with bodies in them. Okay. And I'm just paranoid for absolutely no reason. Oh, dude, I hate it when that happens. Because, like, on the one hand, it's like, okay, I was concerned about something that, you know, didn't matter in the end, but it was good, the fact that I was concerned about it, because someday it might matter. But then on the other hand, it's like, okay, I was worried for no reason. It didn't matter this time. Okay. So then the other thing is, it's better to learn from fear than to stay ignorant from confidence. Potentially. Oh. Actually, no, I agree with that. I changed my mind, you're right. Okay, so then the other major thing, I pretty much have it solved, I think, but the whole idea is that we need to send, like, when something happens in a dungeon, we need to notify every single reaction. Or maybe we don't need to notify every single reaction, because if they all have a specific trigger, that might get complicated. So again, I'm going to have to make a choice here. So our two options here is we can say all reactions receive event notifications. But they only react to the right ones. Option 2 is a reaction only receives event notifications that it can react to. But the event subscriptions need to be managed. Okay. So these are our two options when it comes to like the trigger portion of a reaction. So let's say that we have a sword, and the sword's trigger would be like on use, basically. So you would have to open up your inventory, you would have to select the item, and you would have to use the item. Maybe in the case of a weapon, we could make it a little bit easier and just bind an attack button. But, you know, the idea is that you have to, like, manually use the item. It doesn't just happen, right? So our two options here is that whenever anything in the dungeon happens, whether it be somebody moves, somebody dies, a chest gets opened, whenever anything happens, our sword receives a notification. And then it can just filter out the notifications that it doesn't actually care about. In other words, it would filter out everything except for the "Hey, I used the item" event. So we could send every single event notification to the sword and just have the sword figure out the right ones. The other option is that the sword can subscribe to the particular event that it cares about. In this case, the "Hey, I used an item" event. The only issue with that is, so in that case, it would it would subscribe to that event, and then anytime that event happens, the sword would receive the notification. So obviously the benefit is that the sword doesn't receive a bunch of notifications that are completely useless to it. The downside is that if the sword ever breaks or runs out of durability or leaves the player's inventory or something like that, then you're gonna have to unsubscribe to the event. So there's a little bit more, what's the right word? Management overhead. I think that's the right word. There's a little bit more overhead to keeping this a thing. Because the other thing is that if you go with option 2, you're gonna have to actually make something that reactions can subscribe to, right? So with option 1, you just have to create the one subscription thing, the one thing that reactions can subscribe to. With this one, you have to create a bunch of different things that the reactions can subscribe to, so that the reactions can pick and choose which ones they actually do subscribe to. And I would prefer option 2, because obviously I don't like the idea of sending every notification to absolutely everything in the dungeon. The problem is I might not know ahead of time which potential events could be sent. So I might have to go with option 1. which I think is okay. Oops. I think it'll be fine. Okay, and then the conditions. So the condition is a little bit interesting. The way that I did it before was that I had basically like so you would have some condition object, and then you can have a like a compound condition, which is in and of itself a condition. And then a compound condition could have a list of conditions itself, and then like some what's the right word? Combiner? That doesn't feel right. It's not giving me a red squiggly line, so I guess that's a correct word. So like a compound condition would have a bunch of other conditions and a combiner. And then a condition itself would have like an is met function, right? So then the compound condition, that is met function would like, it would loop through all of these conditions, check to see if those are met, and then combine them in some way. So this combiner could be like an or an and, basically. So if the combiner was and, for example, then it would check all of these conditions in this list, and it would make sure that all of them are true, because this is and then the compound conditions is met function would then return true. And if any of these were false and the combiner was and, then this would return false. So we could have this sort of recursive setup, because obviously because a compound condition is a condition and it has a list of conditions, it could also potentially have a list of compound conditions. So you can have compound conditions having compound conditions, and you know, there's this whole recursive setup. So you could get very complex conditions, right? For example, you could have a condition that's like, you know, the furthest enemy to the west is at 7 health or less, and also the player is 9 tiles or more away from that enemy. Right? Some compound condition we could create using this sort of a system. Or like complex condition, I guess I should say. So that's how I did it before. And I feel like it could work. I do like the way that that's put together. The action is a bit like all over the place, I think, because the action highly depends on like what the target generator is going to return. But I mean, I guess we would just have a similar setup where we'd have a base action class, and then we could have an action with an input type, And that would like extend from the base action. So then this would effectively be, not be, but it would like contain a function that takes in this certain input type and does something with it. And then this input type and this return type from the target generator would have to be the same. So then what would happen is the trigger would receive the event notification. It would filter out the ones that it doesn't want to react to. It would then call the isMet function of the condition. And if that's true, it generates all the targets and then passes those targets into the action. And then the action would do the thing, right? So that's sort of the order of the events with this whole reaction system here. And then, yeah, the component just containing state, I think, is a good idea. Because the other thing that I've done previously is I've had some kind of value provider. Excuse me. And then what this does is it just, like, contains some value. And anytime you want this value to change, it would automatically send an event notification. So you don't have to worry about like sending event notifications. The problem with that is that if you have, you know, if you want to implement a mechanic where, let's say, so you and another character, let's say you're the Charmander and I don't remember the name of this Pokemon. So like let's say that you press the up button, right? You want to move one tile up. So you want to implement, or like we as the developer want to implement a mechanic where instead of just like saying you can't move up because there's something in the way, we could say, okay, these two creatures swap places. So if we wanted to implement that, and we were using this value provider, which automatically sends event notifications, we could run into a scenario where we try and change the location of the player, the Charmander, and we would also have to change the location of this other character at the same time, but we can't do it at the same time because as soon as we try and change the location of the Charmander, the value provider is going to send an event notification. But we don't want it to send an event notification because technically the dungeon is not in a valid state yet because we haven't updated the location of the second creature. So what we would have to do is update the location of both creatures and then send the event notifications for both of their locations having changed. So we would need some way of dealing with that. So we can't have this sort of generic value provider that just like always sends an event notification whenever its value changes. And being that we could have, you know, some kind of extremely complex mechanic, I don't think there's a super easy way to like automatically send event notifications. I think we're just gonna have to force the developer of the mechanic to manually send the event notifications, which feels like a bit of a hassle, but I don't really think that there's a better way to do that. right? Because depending on how complex the mechanic is, there could be a bunch of values that need to change in order for the dungeon to go from one valid state to the next valid state. And obviously we don't want to be sending event notifications if the dungeon is not in a valid state. So yeah, whoever's developing the mechanic is going to have to be the one to decide when the event notifications happen. Now, what we could do is still have a value provider, but instead of automatically sending the event notification, it would just provide the caller. So, like, imagine we have some kind of event or value provider object, and within it, it's got, you know, the value. And it would also have some function that's like set value, new value, right? And then, you know, somewhere else in the code we want to call that. So we would, you know, say value provider dot set value to something. Now, the way that I did it before was when you called this function, again, it would just automatically send an event notification. But because of this whole idea that you can want a value to change without the dungeon being in a valid state, I think what I want this to do is actually just return an event notification. And so we have the notification, we just haven't sent it yet. And so then we can do whatever else, you know, we can have whatever other code we want, and then eventually we can just say, like, send the event notification, right? Something like dungeon dot send, and then pass in the event notification, right? Either something like that or event notification dot send, right? I don't know exactly how I want to do it yet, but you could imagine something like this, right? Do other things. So we would have this value provider object, which would basically like be a wrapper around the actual value. So let's say, for example, this is the X coordinate of the player. So we would have a value provider. The value would be the X coordinate. And then we could change that X coordinate by calling this function. And so we would call the function, it would return to us an event notification. And then let's say we also want to change the Y coordinate of the creature, or the player in this case. We could do that, you know, after we set the X coordinate. We could do that, and then once we're done, we would send the event notification that we have changed the X value. I think that makes sense. Wait, I didn't see this before. The sword can subscribe, change the Y coordinate of the creature. Exactly. I mean, What other issues was I having? I'm trying to remember. I don't know. That's all I can think of for now, actually. Oh. So the Okay, I am reminded of one of the issues. So, one issue is, let's say we have, or we want to create an item that's like a shield, for example. If we want it to have some kind of effect that's like, whenever the incoming damage is 5 or less, reduce it to 0. Right? Something like that. The way that we have this set up is that the value has to actually change in order to generate an event notification. So what I've done in the past is I've actually had this function, instead of immediately changing the value, it will actually send out a value change request. And then you can have something, you can have a reaction where the trigger is a value change request. Would that be a reaction? So if you have a shield that reduces incoming damage to 0 if the incoming damage is 5 or less, is that a reaction? I mean, I guess it would make sense to be a reaction, right? Because there is an attack attempt. And the attack attempt would have the amount of damage attached to it. Right, so let's just imagine there's some abstract object that is called attack attempt. That object would have damage attached to it. And then the shield would have a reaction to that attack attempt. And the action would be to reduce the incoming damage by a certain amount. But see, then we run into order issues. So if we have, let's say, 2 items, one that reduces incoming damage to 0 if the incoming damage is less than or equal to 5, and we have a second item that says reduce incoming damage by half, or like by 50% or something like that, however you want to phrase it. It divides by 2 the incoming damage. Then we get into a situation where the order of which item procs first matters. So then do we have like some predetermined order that the player can then like rearrange the items in their inventory to take that into account? Or do we have some kind of system I feel like we would have to make some kind of smart system. Right, because in practice, what we would have to do is we would have to basically iterate over every cell in the grid, every cell in the dungeon floor, and we would have to go through all the layers. And if a layer has an entity, we would have to send the event notification to the entity so that the entity can then send it to all of its reactions. So then, like, the order in which we iterate through the grid cells is also going to matter. So, like, I feel like that would make it a little bit unfair because, you know, if we just, like, for example, start in the top left and go to the right and then go down one row and then go to the right, then, like, the northwest quadrant of the dungeon would have all of their reactions trigger first. Or I guess everything at the top of the dungeon would have all of their reactions trigger first. Which doesn't feel good to me. We could also potentially just have it ordered by proximity to the player. So, for example, we could send all the event notifications to the player first, and then we could send it to all the cells that are within one of the player, and then within two of the player, 3, etc., etc. But even then, it's like, okay, if we send the event notification to the player, and then we send the event notification to every entity within one tile of the player, there still could be multiple entities that are within one tile of the player, so which do we pick first? Do we make it arbitrary? Do we just keep a list of all the entities and then whichever ones were created first get the event notification first? Or do we try and come up with some intelligent system that, like, collects all the potential modifications and executes them all at the same time instead of doing one at a time? Because that is something that I've tried before, is making a smart system, but it does get a little bit more complicated. Because then we would have to basically have reaction version 2 that doesn't, where the triggers are not the event notifications, the triggers are instead the value change requests. So then this would be like event reaction, and then we would have to have like an entirely different thing. No. That's like value change request reaction. Honestly, though, that might be better. So this set value, instead of immediately assigning the new value to the value, we would instead send a value change request out throughout the dungeon. And every entity could have value change request reactions, which now I'm not sure. I'm not sure if a value change request should technically be an event notification. Because like something hasn't happened yet, we're just trying to see if it will happen. So I feel like it should be separate. Excuse me. So then this action so then I feel like it should have like some kind of function that returns like a value modification, right? So then what we could do is we could send the change request to all the entities in the dungeon. They would each return a value modification, and then we could have some modification resolver that takes the original desired value change along with all of those modifications, and it figures out what the new value should actually be. So going back to the shield example, let's say we have a shield and a chest plate. And let's say that the chest plate reduces incoming damage by 50%. And the shield says if incoming damage is 5 or lower, reduce it to 0. So then what we would do is we would say, okay, we are attempting to change the value of the player's health by, let's say, 8. Right? So the current value is, let's say, 10. And the new value would be 2. So we are trying to assign the player's health to 2. So what it would do is it would send out a value change request to every entity in the dungeon, which inevitably the player would receive because the player is an entity. And the player would then send that request to all of the items in its inventory, and the shield item would then return a value modification that basically says, okay, it's not 5, the change is not 5 or less, so don't actually do anything. And the chest plate would return a value modification that says, okay, divide it in half. And then those two modifications would then come back to this guy. And this guy would have some kind of thing that would resolve that. That would say, okay, initially we wanted to assign the health to 2, but now we've received this modification. Well, we received one modification that says do nothing, right? Because the incoming damage is 8 and not 5 or less. And then we've got this other modification that says instead of assigning the value to 2, we should assign it to 4. Right? Because incoming damage is 8. The chest plate halves it to 4. Oh, no. It would be 6 then. Because our current health is 10. Just for the sake of example. We are about to take 8 damage, but our chest plate halves that 8 damage to 4. So then we would assign our health value to 6. I think that makes sense. Because then that sort of gets rid of the ambiguity of, well, if the chest plates affect procs first, then it would reduce incoming damage to 4, and then if the shields affect procs second, it would reduce it to 0. A headache is starting, and I want to minimize the intensity. Oof, yeah. Have a good one. I appreciate you stopping by. Take care of yourself. You know, so effectively, if the chest plate procs first and then the shield, incoming damage would effectively be 0. Versus if the shield procs first and then the chest plate, the incoming damage would be 4. But then if we do it this way, where we just get all the modifications all at once and then apply them, or we get all the modifications first and then apply them all at once, then it's less ambiguous. Because then the shield effect only applies to the initial incoming damage, not the incoming damage after the chest plate gets procced. I think that makes sense. Okay. And I can almost guarantee that I'm going to run into some kind of an issue later on trying to actually implement all of this stuff. I just... Yeah, so like this would also have to have this stuff in it, I think. So it'd have to have a trigger so that it only reacts to the correct change requests. I don't actually think it would need a target generator because it's only ever going to... But yeah, like what if I do want something that procs prior to a value actually changing? Just the attempt of changing a value procs something. Yeah, so I would have to have an action. But this would effectively be this. Right, but it could also do other things. Okay. But like, you know, this would also receive target. Okay. I think that's okay. I'm trying to think of ways that this could go wrong. And I can't really think of any. So I'm sure that this was relatively incomprehensible. It was just kind of me throwing ideas out there. But I think once we start getting into actually writing the code, it'll make a little bit more sense. And I don't know that I want to do that right now, because I think the other part of what I was struggling with, I kind of mentioned this before, is that I've tried a bunch of different languages, not a bunch, but I've tried different languages, I've tried different tools, and I don't really feel like any of them felt super good. I don't know that they ever are going to feel super good. I'm just considering effectively making my own engine, but not like a general purpose engine, just something very specific to this game, which obviously comes with its own challenges. But I'm just not a huge fan of the way that game engines operate. Like, obviously I've got Godot, and I've used Unity before, but I feel like I have significantly less control over the project in the ways that I want when I'm using a game engine. And from what I understand, like, it doesn't matter that much. But I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of like graphics programming, so I don't know that I'm gonna mess around with like my own render or any of that stuff. But obviously that means that I would have to look into finding some kind of tool that does that for me. But yeah, I'm gonna have to do that. But I think this could work. I think this is a good system. And this is just sort of a lot of previous ideas that I had that I feel like come together in a way that I hadn't thought of before. And yeah, this thing was a major realization that we can just have this base type and then have a generic type that's that inherits from it. Because I was entirely under the assumption that that was a huge performance hit, but it seems like that's not a really bad issue. Which is maybe a code smell, but I think in this instance it's fine. I can't really think of another intuitive way to do that. But yeah, I'm gonna have to take a look into the different technologies that are that can be used. I think I still want to stick with C Sharp. I was also considering going a little bit more low level. I've been considering learning Rust. Just because I feel like it's an interesting language. And I enjoy C++ in theory. But C++ has its issues. So I wouldn't be like super stoked to make a game in C++, but I also don't know that I'm super stoked to make a game in Rust. I feel like out of everything I'm most comfortable is C Sharp. So I think I'll just stick with that for the sake of simplicity. And then, yeah, like if I could figure out, like I'm fine with like loading assets. It's really just the rendering that I'm not a huge fan of doing my own stuff with. So if I could find a way that's like super easy to render stuff in a game-like environment, that would be fantastic. Because I really like, I can use a game engine and just like write the majority of the code in like a script or something, but it just doesn't feel as good, you know? It feels weird to do that. So yeah, I think I just need to do some research and find out if there are any like good renderers out there that don't come with all the extra game engine stuff. Not that it's like a whole lot, but there is some stuff in a game engine that I would feel more comfortable doing myself. Not because it's unreliable, but just because I want to do it, you know? Anyway, I think that was good. I think I got the main technical design figured out. And I feel like I have a much better vision of what I want this to be and what I want it to look like. All right. I think I'm going to call it there. Cuz I don't really know what else to do with the game design. So I'm going to go ahead and call it. I appreciate everybody that was here. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. But for now, peace.